the question then becomes, well, what is the role of work in our life with respect to human flourishing? And once we square away that question, then we can think about the integration of AI into work and ask ourselves, does this enhance in a humanizing way, or does it bring about a dehumanizing mode?
Welcome to the Explorations Podcast, Conversations on a Life Well Lived. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to be joined by my wonderful co-hosts and good friends, Edwin and Joe. Joe, how are you doing? Edwin, how are you guys doing today?
Feeling great. Just came back from the gym, had my little protein smoothie, so I'm ready to go.
Yeah,
Edwin, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I mean, I'm not hitting the gym like Joe is right now, but all is good. All is good.
We're trying to live our best life. As you can see, I'm in a data center because today's conversation is following up a previous conversation that we had quite a while back, especially in the world of technology, on AI, on man and machine. And we definitely encourage you, the listener, to check out our previous conversations. But guys, I wanted to sit down and talk with you today, just kind of looking at a state of AI, looking at a state of the relationship that we as people are having to our tools and how they have shifted by anything that's connected to the internet, basically. And I'm hoping that in our conversation today, we get into a little bit of geopolitics, the ways that technology have affected that space and how that ultimately affects us as individuals. Because I'm hoping that by the end of our conversation today, the listener, everyone involved listening in on this conversation, get a sense of I don't know, just a way of identifying the angst and anxiety that I think is universally experienced, like on a global level, as a species, as one people. I feel like that having conversations like this kind of help us all. It kind of probes in ways that make us feel uncomfortable, but ultimately develop that muscle, kind of like Joe hitting the gym, you know? So all that to say, Edwin, I wanted to start off the conversation by asking you the first question, getting your take, because there was a lot of enthusiasm in our last conversation when it came to AI and LLMs and the next generation. And you've talked about being a dad and the way that you've been guiding your children and their use of AI and technology. So I'm really excited to hear from you. Like, what is your take on it as of right now? Like, how have you experienced it in both positive and negative ways? And what's your current outlook on AI, on AGI, LLMs, all these abbreviations? Like, what's your take on all this stuff?
Yeah. A lot of the discussion we've had on AI sort of surrounded around what could be. I honestly, those discussions was a window to what currently is. And that in of itself is a little scary in that our discussion is sort of at pace, like in terms of what could be, is on pace with what is actually happening, right? The developments in AI. And I remember a professor in college who once said, used to work, for the DoD, who once said, okay, if you want to understand what the technology, like the capacity of technology is today, 10x what you currently see right now. And that's what's out there, but not out to the public. If you think about that and you extrapolate where we are today, this is a little interesting, right? From a both power dynamic perspective and from sort of understanding self perspective, right? And would love to hear Joe's perspective on some of that. But just sort of a quick rundown on what's happening, right? One, we now have agents, or what's called AI agents, right? That was not yet possible the last time we spoke about it. There were still discussions. AI agents, everybody was afraid once we got to AI agent, the world would end. There was a lot of conversation around that because it's like, okay, once AI is able to actually act in the world, that's it, right? and I haven't seen anything devastating happen yet, right? Doesn't mean it's not going to, right? But that's the first, right? We're adapting to AI agents as if it always was part of the plan, and it quite frankly, most people were warning against it. So those are out in the world, and so then if you talk about deep research, Joe and I had a brief conversation about this. If you talk about the ability for AI to do deep research, it's now at the PhD level. Like before, we're talking about, oh, it's undergraduate level. Now it's at the PhD level. And some of the stuff that these LLMs are able to produce are pretty great sort of first drafts. If you know how to prompt it right and you give it the necessary information. So that's another thing. And again, I think we're accepting that as if, okay, well, that was always part of the plan. And the disruption that you were talking about, it has not yet happened yet, but it could. And then the third thing is that we now have, you touched on this, Louis, in terms of geopolitics. We now have another country that's capable of creating something similar, and that country is China, right? Mm-hmm. And not only able to create something similar, they're able to create it at allegedly with a less expensive infrastructure. So lots have happened, but I'll pause there. But this is at least to me, Back to the Future type of thing here.
Yeah, just a quick follow up, Edwin. Like for you, it's even just if you look back 6 months, your usage of the tools. If you can just clarify if you've used tools like deep research, if you used any sort of like AI agent tools, and as you have bridged the gap between what you were predicting and your actual experience of like using those tools. If you could just kind of walk us through the realizations that you were having and the reality checks that you were having as the reality of the tools set in. Because I think as we bring Joe into the conversation, we'll get into like the hype factor of it all and some of the ways in which AI hasn't reached the level that everyone's kind of hoping to. So if you can just kind of share, like just in your own experience of using the tools and how you've experienced that, like what was that like?
Yeah, so I'll quickly go through some of the use cases. The most recent, and probably at least for me, the one that jolted me the most was its analytical abilities. Right, it's always been that if you've played around with some of these tools, you would feed it some data set. It would come back with something pretty rudimentary about like, all right, this is what's on the data set, that type of thing. You probably had to do a lot of cleanup still and so on. I recently did that, and I asked it for a presentation. In this case, I mostly use Claude and ChatGPT. At this point, I go back and forth. In this scenario, I actually used Claude, and what it threw back at me was something that typically would have taken me maybe several hours, if not a day. And that was sort of existential level type of type of disruption to me psychologically, right? Because it's like, the previous tool I was like, all right, I'm getting better, 30% better, and so on. Now you're talking about 2x, 5x the speed of the work that I used to do, right? This is not like talking about someone else and saying, all right, well, it's going to take these folks' work away and make my work a little easier. Now it's like, it's literally my job. So the abilities are moving quickly. And this is literally an experimentation that I recently undertook and applied to my own work. And then what that means is that I've had to reimagine my work right now, take a little like a meta level in terms of the type of things that I'm doing. I'm spending more time thinking about how do I add value, which I think is a worthwhile thing to do. I think it's a really important part of what every person should be going through right now is thinking through value proposition. Like what, in the thing that I do, how do I reimagine it given that I now have this toolkit?
I really like the big question that you pose at the end of how do I add value. I think every single word of that question is going to need like a conversation. And I wanted to bring Joe into this conversation to kind of to keep us at that meta level of like human and work and working, and also if you can touch briefly on your personal and direct experience with AI in the last 6 months or so, or just kind of like your perception of it, um, and just how you view, in light of this conversation, just the perspective on AI and LLMs, and just kind of where humanity is kind of moving in the digital world and the work world.
Yeah. The past 3 to 6 months, I've no doubt been using things like ChatGPT, Claude, some other large language models, just to play around with it, both in thinking through certain ideas academically and having, as it were, a kind of partner, virtual partner to bounce my ideas off. And what that has done is it has, in many ways, catalyzed my own thinking. It's really galvanized it in certain directions. The drawback, however, in doing that, I've noticed is the tendency to default um, to AI as the generative space through which these novel ideas or a reassessing of classical ideas are ushered forth from, rather than relying on my own sort of contemplative gaze on the material. And so there's a subtle dance there. I've also used it for everyday tasks. I actually just recently played around with, as I'm grading my students' work, discussion posts, assignments, and things like that. I said, I fed the AI. I said, here's the prompt that I've asked my students to give, and here are some responses. I want you to grade it based on this criteria, which I grade. And boom, 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 boom. It gives the grades, and it gives all the responses, which has been neat insofar as it cuts back the grading time. Now, I'm not, excuse me, just merely copying and pasting, right? I'm looking at how AI is generating a response, and it poses as a sort of counter to how I would respond. And so anyway, it's been fun and fascinating. Nevertheless, again, recognizing the perennial temptation, I think, that stands before us, I'll speak in the I, stands before me with the use of AI. The question of the space of the human being as such is actually critically important. What I mean by that is, as Edwin has, I think, articulated beautifully, thinking about our own vocation, our own particular spaces in which we engage in work, thinking about those spaces and places in a reframing way, right? How do we re-envision, recognizing that the new tools are going to displace, in many ways, and already are doing that, some of the particular skill sets and gift mix we bring to the table, right? So it's like, okay, well, if I would like to continue to do what I do, the question fundamentally then becomes, how can I do what I do? Like, who am I in relation to this vocation? Insofar as I have this powerful tool that I have recourse to, right? So all of that there comes up, and naturally for me, as a philosopher, as a theologian, I typically have recourse to several sources as I think about technology and the relationship to the human being as such. But we can go there, but that's just my initial remarks.
Yeah. So you, in effect, you reinvented the Scantron machine for your grades.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
I
And I'm sure I'm
mean,
not the only one.
that right. But I find it, in a way, I find it admirable to kind of like have, I would argue, like you're putting an extra kind of detail to that process that, in a way, you kind of automated, because like I've known you for quite a while, and I can imagine the amount of times you've had to grade papers and people's work and stuff. So
Yeah.
it's interesting, this dynamic, and I'm hoping we can kind of tease this out. This idea of like outsourcing versus augmentation. I feel like that's one tension or major pain point that I and what I see and hear other people are wrestling with, as they find ways of automating just like certain parts of their work, and as they also, as we generate new things, that really resonated with me, this idea of like versus wrestling with it like on my own, like walking in nature or like out on a beach or something, or like just with a notebook. I'm either talking to my phone or writing it out on a computer. So I was hoping that we could take the conversation there. This just this idea of like wrestling as human beings, this idea of like augmentation versus outsourcing. Like, how do we? I feel like we are already like we're already interacting with AI at this point, so it's not even like theoretical of using it. It's just like how do we form the right way of using it, like as individuals, like how do we, like how do we begin to shape using it in a way that helps us in a pursuit of a life well lived.
It's a great question. Edwin, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah. I think there's models in the world that we can look to around some of this, and this probably invites a lot of scrutiny, but I don't. What's the difference between in the question that you're asking? What's the difference between using AI, right, to help you with some of this work versus hiring someone to do that same work? So, I think this sort of concept of outsourcing, Lewis, is an important one. This literally was the invention of business and organizations, right? Was this, the concept of, we went from artisans. I don't think we're having conversations about like, whether or not we have a capitalist society, or do we go back, where we rely on organizations and sort of groups versus artisans who are, who have these specific skills. And so
Right.
like we're beyond that. The question is, we're now allowing ourselves to interface with technology in a way that we've always had with each other. I for one, maybe I watch too much science fiction, but I for one am a huge advocate of leveraging that model of human relationship to help us define the relationships that we have with technology. Because in my mind, intelligence is intelligence. Now we can go into like, all right, the importance of emotions and so on, and intelligence. When it comes to like, if we're going to stick to work and the things that we can do, intelligence is intelligence. And so from that perspective, what we're doing is we're helping to scale up the abilities of everyone, right? We're allowing everybody to go out there and hire a low grade analyst to help them with the things that they do, which means that everyone now has to think like they're a one person organization empowered by agents, right? Or virtual employees. So that's kind of like the model I jump into this with.
Just a follow up, like, is my concern is that that becomes the requirement for all people to have a kind of relationship with AI and LLMs, and I wonder if, like, I don't know if that makes it inherently kind of like unfair,
Of course,
like a new kind of access and stuff.
That's right. I mean, you're Luddites, right?
Yeah.
We've had this conversation, man. Look, if you're not engaged with the technology because you're afraid of it and so on. I literally had this conversation about a year ago where someone came to me and said, "Okay, this is getting scary. I am not engaging with this tool because it is like it's going to be out of control." And I said, "Fine. I respect sort of the ethical perspective that you have on this."
Mm-hmm.
But the world's going to do it anyway. So then what? So it's going to, what's going to happen to you as others progress, right? It's because the problem that we have in the world today is that we are inherently competitive. Right. And the point I was trying to make is, if that's what you're concerned about, then we need to have a conversation about capitalism, not about AI, right? AI is just another force multiplier that allows let's go there, allows the inequality that exists within our society to accelerate. That's the reality, right? And a lot of the work that I do now is to help mitigate some of that. But the best thing to tell anyone who's in that scenario is not, oh yeah, you're right. This is this is causing more inequality. Therefore, we should stop it. That's it in a capitalist society. That's a losing person's dream. That's just not gonna happen. So then my rebuke was that I need you to empower yourself as the person who actually has the ethical values to then empower yourself and sort of force multiplying the ideas that you have about AI itself, right? So you got to use the tool, and if you're not using the tool, you are at a strong disadvantage in what's to come.
Joe, do you have a response to that? Like, I wonder if someone's also just wrestling with their sense of self, or just even like the eye at just kind of like the start of figuring out their relationship with AI, like what what sort of response and take do you have in light of what Edwin was sharing and what Edwin is kind of suggesting, that there's an inevitability to AI and work in a capitalist society?
Yeah, I think what Edwin is saying, and let me just pause for a minute and say to everyone, if you hear noises emanating from the background, that's my 8-month-old being an 8-month-old. Thank God for his presence in the background and such a conversation, right? Because it grounds us and it humanizes, at least for me, the conversation. But I think what Edwin is saying is, for the most part, correct, right? I think turning a blind eye to these technological innovations, for better or worse, is not the real solution. Now, one could choose by way of a kind of a moral protest to say, you know what, I'm going to default to the other apparatuses that I have access to. I'm not going to have recourse. I'm not going to use this AI. That's that person's decision. But within the socioeconomic and political frame in which we find ourselves in, probably not the best decision if one is concerned with socioeconomic growth and stability. Now, one could say, look, I don't care about making more money or having greater impact. I'm more concerned about maintaining and securing my humanity, the dignity and worth of the human being as such. And I see these bubbling technologies as a real existential threat. And so I'm going to choose to say no to that. And if I lose money, if I lose, power, resource, if I experience on the darker side, the greater inequality, then so be it. I will suffer that. And my hat is off to those persons. Again, may or may not be the solution. All depends on the particular goal. Nevertheless, from a 1,000-foot view or 33,000-foot view on the problem, we have to consider, I think, philosophically, what's at stake. And look, AI grants us an increase in power, and the fallenness, I'm here bringing in a theological insight of the human condition, is such that we tend to have a sort of default to the will to power, right? The will to power. Friedrich Nietzsche will speak of the will to power. Sigmund Freud will speak of it to some degree, although he speaks of the pleasure principle, the will to pleasure, Alfred Adler, right? So you have this whole thing of the will to power. And let's say, okay, people long for this access, right? Boom, this thing is giving me greater utility, right? And what that shows is a real danger of the will to power displacing or replacing the gift of being. The gift of being, which sounds really contemplative and spiritual. Like, what does that mean? We would have to, right, articulate that. But just take the gift of being as simply the receptive, just the recognition of the isness, the reality that is before us comes to us as a contingent reality, and thus is pure gift, right? Now, again, when we disseminate that, we sort of press into that. Let's lean into that for a second. What does that mean in relation to this conversation? Well, look, let's go back to the example that I brought up, right? That my using of AI to help grade some homework sets. Or something I've done recently is to use AI to generate a midterm exam. That was fun, right? I said, here, this is the material I'm teaching my students in logic, my course in logic. Here are the resources. Give me 7 to 10 short answer questions that I can put forth in a midterm exam. Boom, like that in 2 seconds, right? It's able to do that, and I'm able to kind of play with it. What? That's amazing in terms of utility, right? In terms of utility, in terms of efficiency, in terms of effectiveness. What is that loss? The loss is the process through which I would construct the exam. Let's say if I just defaulted to whatever it spit out, like, oh, I'm going to use this, boom, copy and paste. That's what's going to be. The loss is that process of doing that on my own. Now we may say, okay, well, who cares? Like, why would anyone want to sweat blood, sweat, and tears going through that? And that actually raises the anthropological question, which is, well, what is the nature of work? And in our modern, postmodern ethos, we've tend to define, and of course, capitalism in many ways sort of galvanizes and empowers this perspective. We in many ways define work as this kind of or measure work by means of efficiency and utility, rather than the human, all too human aspect of work. And so the question then becomes, okay, is the technological, as it were, displacing the liturgical? Is the technological displacing the liturgical, the work of the people with respect to each other, with respect to the divine and the transcendent? And in some sense, I think the answer is yes. The question is, how do we do this then, therefore, in a humanizing way, and not such a way that we would say, throw the baby out with the bathwater? Again, I that requires further unpacking, but I think that's how I proceed in thinking about it.
So just going back to that, the tension of incorporating the tool in our daily lives in some form or fashion, and identifying the things that we want to make more efficient. It brings to mind the show Severance. It just had its season finale yesterday.
Never seen it, bro.
It is incredible. I don't want to spoil it, but
where is it streaming?
It's on Apple TV.
Ooh,
Apple
that's
TV.
Too rich for my blood, brother.
Listen, this is like, how House of Cards, how it sold the idea on Netflix of like a TV show.
Mm-hmm.
This is Apple TV's like version of that, and the main idea is that this is in a world where this man has like a procedure done to his head. And so when he goes into his work building, his next like moment of consciousness is basically it's 5 o'clock and his work day's over. And so part of his psyche, I guess, is like has been severed. And so there's an innie, like his work version, who only experiences just like working in this office. And then his outie, who is just kind of living his life, but just not knowing what happened at work. And the show, as you can imagine, goes all over the place, like exploring a lot of different themes. The writing is excellent. Mm-hmm. But it reminds me of that, of just like automating efficiency, like taking certain parts of things that, let's say, if we're just talking purely in matters of time, that like something that is going to take me an hour on paper, I can get this to be done in 10 minutes. It's like just in that conversation of identifying where to do that, like what things to mark off in my day to decide to automate or make efficient. It's like, how do I begin to answer that question? Because I feel like an answer gets made whether we're kind of involved in the conversation or not. Kind of like with the microwave, microwave beep.
Well said.
But yeah, that's the big question on my mind after hearing what you shared, Joe. And I'm wondering if you guys can kind of, I don't know, like just keep guiding us through that into figuring that out.
Let me start with a high level response to that and get a bit more tangible. I think, Joe, you'll be really helpful with the more individual response to some of this. In listening to the both of you, what's come to mind is that, and Joe said a little bit of this as well, AI is highlighting the weaknesses in our socio-political economic systems, right? you know, everyone loves to blame AI and say, how do we fix AI? You know, AI is a tool like any other tool, right? Or technology like any other technology. And what it's doing, and it's lowering the waters for us to see the cracks in our systems, right? The failure of education, the lack of moral, ethical institutions, the issues the familial issues that we're facing, in identity, and you know the psychological aspect of the our interactions with technology and social media and so on. These things already exist, and it's just showing us that the issue with an evolving future when we don't pay attention to those institutions. And so implicit in what I just said is the solution, which is we need to start thinking of ourselves more broadly. I know Joe's like, from a philosophical and theological perspective, thinks a lot about this. I would love to hear his perspective. But we're unidimensional in our way of thinking, right? I've spoken a little bit about the exploitative nature of capitalism, not because there's some boogeyman out there, but because of the way that we think about ourselves within a system where the incentives is to make more money. So in that world, right, it becomes all consuming that is our purpose, right? Because our purpose, like, okay, I need to go to work because I need to feed my family. I need to go to work because I need to have shelter. I need to go to work because, so everything is associated with that. And AI has nothing to do with that, except that it might, to your point, Lewis, and what you're pointing to, it makes things a lot more efficient. So what the problem that we're going to have is, what do we do with the time that we buy? So as we do become more efficient, right? Everyone is complaining about like, oh my God, it's going to take my work away. You know, in some ways, maybe I'm a bit nihilist about this. In some ways, I want that to happen. I want us not to have any work to do, because what that does is it exposes, the need for us to engage in the human activities that have always been important to us. So the question is, how do you do that well, right? How do you feed your spiritual self? How do you feed your intellectual self? How do you feed your, on and on and on, in a way that makes you more whole? It doesn't, right? Everyone's going to want to blame AI and say, "Oh my God, we're zombies because of AI." And the reality is not. No, AI is just exposing the thing that has always existed, because now our time has been exposed. So yeah, Joe, I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. I think what would need to be cultivated is a robust understanding of work. Because I see work more integral to the human vision and human ethos. Now, it, of course, work is work. So there is the sweat of the brow that comes forth from that. The question then becomes, well, what is the role of work in our life with respect to human flourishing? And once we square away that question, then we can think about the integration of AI into work and ask ourselves, does this enhance in a humanizing way, or does it bring about a dehumanizing mode? Or is there a combination of the two? And in what way and in what sense can we move forward in light of this? The technological stands as a question itself. I think of the philosopher, the 20th century eminent philosopher, Martin Heidegger. He writes on technology in the middle of the 20th century, really probably one of the most important pieces on the question of technology in the 20th century. It literally is titled The Question Concerning Technology by Martin Heidegger. And, he's not a Luddite. He doesn't think we need to put our heads into the sand and reject all technology as such. But he will say, no, the reality is that technology reveals reality to us in a certain mode. And the mode in which it does is we end up, through technology, perceiving reality, nature, etc., as a kind of stockpile, ready to be like sort of a reserve, right? And such. It's only a means to an end, and we are the masters and progenitors of that. And that changes, that vision then begins to change what it means to be human, and it affects us. I think of Michel Henry, right, and his work Barbarism. I think of Romano Guardini, letters from Lake Como. All of these thinkers who are reflecting on technology. One recognizes here, I'm thinking of Michel Henry, right, recognizing that life is unfortunately now lived by means of a kind of representation, right? There's a distance. We no longer are living the auto effect of life, right? That life is a pathos to be experienced and to be lived. And when we have default by means of a kind of externalizing and outsourcing, we are no longer able to have that intimate connection with life as such. Again, all that needs to be unpacked, right? Romano Guardini will speak of the form of the technological life as formless, and we've lost proper proportion and form, and that there's an art to life and the God-givenness of reality. All of these things need to be squared away, I think. All of these things need to be explored in relation to something like AI. And the rabbit hole goes deep, but it's a rich conversation. And what's at stake is everything, in my mind. In past conversations, I've said, our technology has indeed surpassed our humanity in many ways. And so if we're going to up our game, we need to become the kinds of persons that are contemplative, that are really sitting with the questions rather than defaulting and running towards the next best thing or moving towards a kind of efficiency modality, right? And a kind of utility mindset. I don't want to demonize efficiency and utility. I'm not here to do that, but I recognize that there's a tendency to default to that mode, and to think we are somehow getting at life better, like we're somehow arriving at a greater flourishing by means of a greater efficiency and utility. And that's where I would offer the pushback, and say we need to take several steps back and really reframe it again and think about it.
Just based on what you shared, Joe, I was thinking earlier in the conversation, I referenced 2001: A Space Odyssey, and in that movie, it's like these ape-like beings discover like the first tool, like man's first tool, and there's a famous cut in that movie that cuts through thousands of years of human civilization, essentially. And I wonder if part of the tension that we're wrestling with as human beings today, that I wrestle with, is this this idea of designing the next tool. Like, it feels like we're in a time of, like, we see an opportunity to change the way that we interact with the world. And even though it's on a digital level, and ironically it's all in a digital space,
Yeah.
we have the opportunity to design our interaction in a very unique way. And I say that, like, as I've kind of educated myself on different platforms and ways in which you can now interact with your computer, like they have changed dramatically. Even for someone who does not know how to code, I've been exposed to like these incredible no code platforms in which, if I can conceptualize a way of just like translating data, it's possible for me to do that like today, right now. And I think that I feel like I'm in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and like in the monolith, like that moment, like that jump forward moment, AI really feels like that. And I think that's part of the hype and part of the allure of the whole phenomena. But there's definitely some like a kind of proposal in the relationship between to me and the tool in which I generate income with. So yeah, like I just wonder, like, in furthering that conversation, like, is another way of looking at it is like seeing ourselves as designers of this new thing, like of this new tool, of the same way that our ancestors had to like wrestle with an automobile for the first time. Like, it's like we're wrestling with this idea that like it doesn't like any industry, any profession, any occupation, any kind of person could in effect use a computer to change the way that they've been doing something already in such a way that it makes that activity either happen far shorter or the results like higher numbers or whatever, like more productive. Sorry, like more productive or more efficient. And that opportunity is kind of like being dangled, and I do respect the people who make the decision to reject it, but the implications to that rejection feel far greater now than they did even the last time we talked about AI, to be honest. Do you guys have any thoughts on that, like as far as this designer comment and like also just wrestling with that choice, that daily choice, if you will?
Louis, I can offer a what I think might be a fairly practical observation here, and that is that your usage of the of that title, science fiction, is extremely revealing, and to me at least, because in the way that Joe's going to kill me for this, but in the way that Joe was referring to some of our philosophers, I believe people have wrestled with some of these problems through science fiction, and I don't think it's a stretch for us to for many of us, if we really want to understand this, to go watch Star Trek, right? And because these are some of the problems that they've wrestled with, right? So it's a little bit of a shortcut, and I don't think Joe is saying that. All right, you guys go all figure this out, and go read, Plato and a bunch of other philosophers for yourself. Although I strongly suggest that. But there are folks who have done that and extrapolated a modern lens on it by imagining the world. And in a world where things accelerate as quickly as they do, science fiction is no longer a luxury. I think science fiction becomes a sort of a modality for understanding what the things that we are currently dealing with, right? So that's one thing I would point to in terms of the sort of the design piece. And by the way, a lot of the folks in Silicon Valley who are actually struggling with this are doing that's their mode of existence right now, is bringing to life the things that they've learned through their consumption of science fiction as a way of thinking. So that said, things get a little scary when the very tool that we're developing is learning how to do the things that we're doing better than we can. In other words, what happens when an LLM has the ability to build on itself and create a new mode of understanding faster than we can understand it? And I think that's a strong possibility. So right now, I think it is helpful to use the things that have been created from humans to understand what we're facing. There might be a point where that's no longer possible, and we're struggling to understand AI itself and what it's creating for its own understanding, which is kind of breaks the mind a little bit. But that we're not there yet. But that's that's the thing we would have to prepare for.
Just in closing, like, since this is another good kind of checkpoint in this ongoing conversation with AI, I was hoping if you guys can kind of share some forward-thinking comments, like any predictions or outlooks, or even like questions you would have for your future self, in assuming that AI is going to continue to improve and develop. And let's say if we're going to take another look at this 6 months from now, what sort of things would come to mind, or what would you say? What kind of questions would you have, or predictions you would have about the future of AI?
That's a great question. I wonder, questions that I think about are those who, to use a Marxian perspective, who are the ones who own the means of production. who has the keys to the AI kingdom, and what role do they have? What safeguards are put on, and how are we able to adjudicate whether or not the information that is being spit out by these LLMs is either correct, true, and so on. I wonder whether or not we're going to quickly arrive at a place where we will no longer be able to have recourse to this ethereal world called the internet, right? I mean, you made a comment that's interesting in your last remark about how all of this is, through the computer, right? Through that kind of space, and not the flesh and blood space of human to human interaction. So that coupled with social media, we're seeing more and more how truth is harder to become seen and received in many ways, right? Deception is at all-time high. And so I wonder whether or not we're going to have to return to a mode of banking in person, to a mode of political engagement in person, because now we can't even trust whatever is coming to us through the screen, right? Because the deception has, it's just like, you don't even know if this is a computer generated model. Is this really a hologram? Like, what's going on? I really like that thinking about the sci-fi, Edwin, what you were saying, and about, it goes to show the role of humanities, right? The arts and the humanities, insofar as it's about envisioning. And the future that we are creating is a future that is first and foremost envisioned. And so there are different kinds of sci-fi fiction, let's say. And what would it look like to have a sci-fi version of the future that is deeply humanizing, right? Some will make the argument that Star Trek is, right, for a number of reasons. But I think that's going to be important as we are quickly moving forward. What do we want the future to be? But I know that's more of a question than getting at to what you were asking for, Louis. But that's what I would end with.
Yeah, that was so beautifully said, Joe, that I could just add to it, which is next question for me would be, how do you prepare for that future? How do you educate yourself and so on? And there's not a great response here from my perspective, except to engage in the AI in of itself, right? If you're shy about it, if you made a moral decision, that I can't, nothing I can say about that. But if it's something that you're just waiting for, I strongly suggest that you jump in. And, in the way that someone would have said, I am not dealing with these computers. It's not for me. The first thing that you would tell anyone is say, just open up the computer and start playing around. Right. So I would suggest the same thing. But yeah, Joe, exactly what you said is some of the fears that I currently have as well, in terms of our, especially more concretely, some of the economic instabilities that this is creating. So, and Louis, to answer your question more directly, in in a year or so, or even a couple of months, what do our financial systems look like? To Joe's point about trust, I mean, that's huge. What does our system look like in light of all of that? And I don't know, but it doesn't look good. Which means that maybe we can talk about Viktor Frankl the next time we talk about this. But it's time to dust off those texts and really absorb some of the tools that folks have struggled with in recent time in different contexts. But in my opinion, we're in a much more privileged state from that perspective. So we have the benefit of those learnings, and this is where, from my perspective, sitting on the shoulders of these giants is going to be the way forward.
Amen.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for this conversation. I wanted to pull a stat in researching for this episode. You talked about trust, and there was Edelman's Trust Barometer. It's like this new study that came out in early 2025. And Trust in AI is highest in India, Nigeria, and Thailand and China, with like a high 70%, like 77%, 76%. While in Western nations, in the US and Canada, it's like 32% and 30%. So there's this huge gap in trust in AI, like just as far as like our relationship to it based on a global level. So I look forward to having more conversations about that, because I feel like we were speaking into that all throughout this conversation. It was really helpful for me to just kind of wrestle with these ideas. So thank you guys. I look forward to these conversations.
No, take care.
Thanks, Louis.